The wooden floorboards creaked under careful footsteps as couples moved through the measured steps of the foxtrot. In the dim light of rationed electricity, shadows danced across whitewashed walls that had witnessed weddings, harvests, and christenings for generations. The three-piece band, piano, accordion, and drums, kept time with the precision of a church clock, their melody floating through cigarette smoke and the faint smell of coal dust from winter stores. Then the doors swung open. 6 American servicemen stepped inside, their uniforms crisp despite the June humidity, boots polished to a mirror shine. They moved with a swagger that seemed almost choreographed, chewing gum in unison, crew cuts gleaming under the hall's bare bulbs. One whistled. Another cracked his knuckles. The music faltered for half a beat. The Americans had arrived in Britain. In the spring of 1942, the first contingent of American troops landed in Northern Ireland, followed by waves of servicemen flooding into England throughout the summer and autumn. They came by the hundreds of thousands, farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, jazz enthusiasts from Harlem, all wearing the same olive-drab uniform, all carrying the same impossible confidence that marked them as distinctly, unmistakably American. By the end of 1942, American bases dotted the British countryside like mushrooms after rain. In East Anglia alone, the flat landscapes perfect for airfields hosted what would eventually grow to 400,000 GIs. They took over bases at Debden, Little Walden, Duxford. They filled villages that had never seen a foreigner, let alone heard an American accent. For a nation of 1.7 million in East Anglia, the invasion was seismic. The culture shock was immediate and profound. British servicemen earned perhaps £3 per week. American privates received the equivalent of £21. The Americans moved through rationed Britain like visiting royalty, pockets jingling with money that seemed obscene in a nation where butter came in ounces and sugar in grams. They offered nylon stockings to girls whose legs had been painted with gravy browning to simulate seams. They handed out Hershey bars to children who had forgotten chocolate's taste. They distributed chewing gum like confetti. And they were loud. British Reserve, cultivated over centuries of keeping emotions properly bottled, collided with American informality. The GIs laughed too loudly, talked too freely, walked with hands in pockets. They called officers by first names. They treated war like an adventure rather than a grim duty. To villagers raised on understatement and queuing, the Americans seemed almost alien. At the Red Lion pub in Cambridge, Flight Lieutenant Mallon stood at the bar surrounded by RAF pilots nursing their ration pints. An American P-47 pilot sat alone in the corner, his uniform drawing occasional glances. "The Yanks flew straight into Jerry's teeth yesterday," Mallon said, shaking his head. 60 bombers down at Schweinfurt. They insist on daylight raids without proper escort. Different breed, aren't they? His companion replied. All confidence and no caution. The American shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. The phrase that captured British sentiment spread like wildfire through pubs and parlors. Overpaid, overfed, oversexed, and overhere. It was said with a smile, perhaps, but the edge was unmistakable. The Americans had come to help win the war, but they had also come to upend every careful social arrangement that kept British life orderly. Nowhere was the collision more visible than in the dance halls. Britain had been a dancing nation long before the Americans arrived. Approximately 11,000 dance halls and nightclubs had opened between 1919 and 1926, and dancing remained the primary social activity for millions. Every town had its halls where people gathered to foxtrot and waltz, to meet potential partners, to forget for a few hours the grinding reality of wartime rationing. The dances followed patterns as reliable as train schedules. Men asked women, except during designated ladies' choice numbers. The music was swing, certainly, but tempered by British restraint. Big band arrangements played at civilized volumes, couples maintaining proper distance, movements controlled and respectable. Then the Americans brought the jitterbug. The Lindy Hop had originated in Harlem's Savoy Ballroom in the 1920s, an energetic fusion of jazz, tap, and Charleston that emphasized improvisation, athleticism, and uninhibited joy. British audiences had glimpsed it in American films, had seen Gracie Fields perform a comedic version in Shipyard Sally in 1939, but watching flickering images was entirely different from confronting the reality. At the Hammersmith Palais in London, one of Britain's most famous dance halls, the first jitterbug demonstration stopped conversations mid-sentence. An American GI and his partner, a British girl who'd been learning in secret, took the floor during a break. The band struck up in the mood, and they flew. Spins that seemed to defy physics. Lifts that exposed stockinged legs to gasps from the crowd. The girl's skirt swirled, her feet barely touching the ground as her partner swung her through moves that looked more like acrobatics than dancing. Some spectators applauded. Others stood with mouths agape. A few older women turned away in disapproval. The vicar's wife leaned toward her husband. "Disgraceful," she whispered. But her daughter couldn't look away. The jitterbug violated every rule of proper British dancing. It was too fast, too physical, too uninhibited. Dancers threw partners into the air, moved with abandon that seemed almost dangerous. Moral outrage reached such levels that some venues banned the dance outright. Swimming baths that doubled as dance halls, popular venues across Britain, prohibited jitterbug because the vigorous moves damaged the retractable floors. Yet despite official disapproval, despite the complaints, despite the genuine shock it caused, the jitterbug spread. Young women who spent 12-hour shifts in munitions factories or on farms, doing backbreaking work for the war effort, found in the jitterbug a release that the restrained foxtrot could never provide. For a few hours each week, they could forget about ration books and air raid sirens and the constant fear that any night might bring the whistling descent of German bombs. They could move, really move, in ways that felt gloriously alive. And the Americans, with their easy confidence and generous pockets, made excellent dance partners. British men noticed. In pubs across the country, resentment simmered. These Americans, arriving late to a war Britain had fought alone for 2 years, seemed to be conquering British women with chocolate bars and smooth dance moves. The jealousy was palpable, occasionally erupting into fistfights outside dance halls when closing time sent mixed couples into the night. The situation grew more complex with the arrival of African American troops. Approximately 240,000 of the American servicemen who came to Britain were black. Before 1942, Britain's black population numbered perhaps 8,000 to 10,000, concentrated in port cities like London and Liverpool. For residents of rural villages in Yorkshire, Somerset, or Norfolk, proximity to black people was wholly novel. The American military, still segregated until 1948, brought Jim Crow to Britain. Army administrators insisted on separate facilities, separate leave days for black and white troops, separate sections at dances. The U.S. War Department issued handbooks warning British civilians about the Negro question, suggesting that mixing socially with black servicemen would cause problems. But something unexpected happened. British civilians, while not free from racial prejudice, largely rejected American segregationist demands. The Home Office Directive of September 1942 stated clearly, "It is not the policy of His Majesty's government that any discrimination as regards the treatment of colored troops should be made by the British authorities." More remarkably, ordinary British people, especially women, often preferred the company of black GIs. Letters and diaries from the period consistently described black American servicemen as more courteous, more respectful, and better dancers than their white counterparts. White GIs, by contrast, were frequently characterized as arrogant, flashy, and pushy. This preference infuriated white American servicemen. They watched in disbelief as British women danced with black soldiers, socialized with them in pubs, walked arm in arm through village streets. The prejudice that had been foundational to American life seemed to hold no power in Britain. Tensions exploded in Bamber Bridge, Lancashire, in June 1943. The village, hosting black American troops, became a flashpoint when white military police tried to enforce segregation in local pubs. In response, British pub owners placed signs reading "Black troops only" outside their establishments, a quiet but devastating protest that turned American racism on its head. On a June evening, 2 white MPs confronted black GIs outside the Hob Inn. An argument escalated. Local civilians and British servicewomen sided with the black soldiers. Someone threw a bottle. An MP drew his gun. The situation spiraled into what historians would later call the Battle of Bamber Bridge, a melee fought with billy clubs, bottles, and cobblestones, ending with one black soldier shot and 200 soldiers confronting their white officers. British locals never forgot. They had looked at American segregation, at the Jim Crow laws trying to take root in English soil, and said, "Not here." But if the social dynamics were complex, the music itself was undeniable. By late 1942, swing music dominated American popular culture. Big bands led by Benny Goodman, Duke Ellington, Count Basie, and Artie Shaw played arrangements that combined sophisticated orchestration with irresistible rhythmic drive. The music represented American modernity, confident, energetic, forward-looking. No name loomed larger than Glenn Miller. The Glenn Miller Orchestra had defined the sound of pre-war America. Songs like In the Mood, Moonlight Serenade, Chattanooga Choo Choo weren't just popular. They were the soundtrack of an entire generation. Miller's innovation, placing the clarinet on the melody line doubled by saxophones an octave below, created a signature sound instantly recognizable, smoothly sophisticated, yet powerfully swinging. In 1942, at the absolute peak of his success, Glenn Miller did something shocking. He broke up his civilian orchestra and accepted a commission as captain in the U.S. Army Air Forces. The decision stunned the music industry. Miller was earning the equivalent of a modern fortune, playing to sold-out crowds, dominating radio airwaves. But he watched young men shipping out to distant battlefields and decided his music could serve a greater purpose than entertaining nightclub patrons. "I, like every American, have an obligation to fulfill," Miller told reporters. "That obligation is to lend as much support as I can to winning the war." By 1943, Captain Miller had become Major Miller, director of bands for the Army Air Forces Training Command. He recruited the finest musicians from civilian orchestras, assembling a 50-piece band that exceeded anything the military had fielded before. He modernized military marching music, scandalizing purists by arranging St. Louis blues and Blues in the Night for parade formations. And in the spring of 1944, General Dwight Eisenhower made a request. Allied forces were massing in Britain for the forthcoming invasion of Europe. Morale was critical. Eisenhower wanted entertainment that would remind soldiers of home, that would steel their resolve for the battles ahead. He wanted the best. He wanted Glenn Miller. In May 1944, Eisenhower created the Allied Expeditionary Forces Program, a joint radio network designed to entertain troops from America, Britain, Canada, and Free France. Miller's Army Air Force Band would anchor the American programming. The news spread through British camps like wildfire. Glenn Miller is coming. For American GIs stationed in cold, damp England, far from family, preparing for an invasion that many wouldn't survive, Miller's music represented everything they fought for. It was Saturday night dances in hometown ballrooms. It was first kisses and wedding proposals and nights when the future seemed bright and certain. For British civilians who had learned to recognize Miller's sound from radio broadcasts that slipped past Nazi jammers, his coming represented something else. Validation that the Americans, for all their rough edges and cultural invasions, brought something genuinely valuable. The loud outsiders with their swagger and chewing gum were about to deliver their secret weapon. And it wasn't fighter planes or tanks or bombs. It was music. June 1944. An airfield outside London. The C-54 transport touched down with the grinding shriek of rubber on concrete, taxiing past rows of B-17 bombers that lined the runway like metallic birds of prey. Ground crew paused their work to watch as the aircraft's door opened and a figure emerged in an Army Air Forces uniform, sunlight glinting off his major's insignia. Glenn Miller had arrived in Britain. Behind him came 49 musicians carrying instrument cases, trumpets, trombones, saxophones, clarinets, guitars, drums, string basses, even a harp. They moved with the easy confidence of men who had entertained millions, but also with the discipline of soldiers who understood they served a mission larger than entertainment. Within days, they were performing. The schedule was punishing. Aircraft hangars converted into makeshift concert halls. Munitions factories where workers ate lunch to the sound of In the Mood. Hospitals where wounded soldiers closed their eyes and let familiar melodies transport them home. The Army Air Force Band played anywhere Allied personnel gathered, sometimes 3 performances daily, broadcasts between shows. At an airbase near Bedford, 3,000 servicemen crowded into a hangar normally housing B-24 bombers. The temperature was sweltering despite the June evening, but nobody moved toward the doors. When Miller raised his baton and the band launched into Moonlight Serenade, grown men wept openly. A bombardier from Oklahoma wrote home, "We heard Glenn Miller tonight. Real Glenn Miller, not a recording. For the first time since I left, I felt like I was back in America. I felt like I remembered why we're here." Lieutenant General James Doolittle, commander of the 8th Air Force and architect of the daring 1942 raid on Tokyo, told Miller directly. Next to a letter from home, "Captain Miller, your organization is the greatest morale builder in the European theater of operations." Miller's impact transcended entertainment. His music became a weapon of war. The Allied Expeditionary Forces program broadcast Miller's performances across Europe. Soldiers waiting to storm Normandy beaches tuned in. Resistance fighters in occupied France listened on illegal radios, recognizing in swing music a sound of freedom that Nazi propaganda could never silence. Even German troops, forbidden to listen but unable to resist, secretly tuned their radios to catch forbidden American broadcasts. Jazz had become part of the cultural war raging alongside the actual fighting. The Nazi regime, obsessed with racial purity, had declared jazz inhuman music and banned it throughout occupied Europe. In 1938, Germany passed an official law declaring jazz negroid and a threat to European higher culture. Musicians caught performing swing faced imprisonment. German youths caught listening to Allied radio stations risked beatings or worse from the Gestapo. Yet in cellars and attics across the Third Reich, young Germans calling themselves swing kids met in secret to dance to forbidden American music. They wore their hair long in defiance of Hitler Youth standards. They greeted each other in English. They made jazz music itself an act of resistance. For these rebellious teenagers, Glenn Miller represented everything the Reich opposed: racial integration. His music built on African American innovations, artistic freedom, and the uninhibited joy that totalitarian control sought to extinguish. Miller understood the stakes. "We didn't come here to set any fashions in music," he told a reporter. "We merely came to bring a much-needed touch of home to some lads who have been here a couple of years." But fashion is exactly what they set. Within weeks of Miller's arrival, the jitterbug craze that had been slowly spreading through Britain exploded into a full-blown phenomenon. Dance halls that had resisted the energetic American style suddenly found their evening crowds demanding it. The influx of GIs in 1942 had planted seeds. Miller's band made those seeds bloom. British dance instructors, recognizing the inevitable, attempted to civilize the jitterbug. They created what they called jive, a watered-down, more controlled version of the Lindy Hop that preserved British sensibilities while incorporating American energy. It caught on, though purists on both sides dismissed it as a pale imitation of the real thing. Still, compromise was progress. Dancing was bringing cultures together in ways diplomacy could not. The social centers were packed. Dance halls that had operated at capacity before the war now turned away crowds. An estimated 3 million people attended dance venues every week across Britain. Some nights, the queues to enter the Hammersmith Palace stretched 3 blocks, dancers waiting patiently in blackout conditions for their chance to swing. Dancing became so central to British wartime life that in 1942, Home Secretary Herbert Morrison, himself a keen and accomplished dancer according to the Liverpool Echo, announced officially that dancing would not be prohibited despite the war. It was essential for morale, necessary for national survival. At no time before or after has dance been so popular, a wartime journalist observed. And the Americans were the undisputed masters. American GIs, particularly African-American servicemen, dominated dance floors. They moved with a natural rhythm that seemed effortless, spinning partners through complex patterns that left British dancers studying their footwork. Young women who had initially clutched their purses suspiciously around the loud Americans now lined up for the chance to dance with them. British families began opening their homes. Mrs. Eleanor Hartley of Saffron Walden invited American servicemen to Sunday tea. They arrived bearing gifts: tinned peaches, cigarettes, chocolate bars that her children examined like treasure. The Americans showed photographs of their families in Iowa and Georgia. They asked polite questions about Britain. They helped wash dishes after the meal, an informality that scandalized Mrs. Hartley's mother but charmed Mrs. Hartley herself. "They're not what we expected," she confided to her sister. "They're just boys, really, far from home and trying to be brave." This pattern repeated across Britain. American generosity, the fruit and candy and nylons that filled British homes, created bonds that transcended the initial resentment. The GIs who had seemed like invaders became neighbors, then friends, then sometimes something more. By 1945, 50,000 British women would become GI brides, leaving Britain for new lives in America. Each relationship represented a bridge between cultures, built on dance floors and sealed with swing music. But the path was not smooth. In dance halls, the presence of African American servicemen continued to inflame white American troops. Fights erupted regularly. At the Palace Hotel in Southend-on-Sea, white American sailors attacked a black sailor simply for dancing with a white woman. British civilians intervened, incensed by the absurdity. The victim was forcibly ejected, not by the British, but by his own American officers. A British man named Mark Mendoza wrote directly to Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden, describing the incident with barely contained outrage. American officers ordered the victim out of the place, and in spite of protests from several of the British people who were incensed at this absurd behavior, he was forcibly ejected. British support for black American servicemen was not universal. Racism existed in Britain, but the general warmth with which black GIs were received stood in stark contrast to their treatment in the segregated American military. Many black servicemen later testified that Britain offered them the first taste of true equality they had ever experienced. One African American soldier wrote, "In Britain, I could walk into any pub, sit at any table, and be treated like a human being. It showed me what life could be like if America lived up to its promises." Glenn Miller's band, meanwhile, maintained its exhausting schedule. Between June and December 1944, the Army Air Force Band performed over 800 shows. They broadcast on the Allied Expeditionary Forces program 6 days a week. They recorded special performances for the Armed Forces radio service. They played at airfields where crews prepared for bombing runs over Germany. They performed in hospitals where wounded soldiers, missing limbs or eyes, closed their remaining eyes and smiled. The music was everywhere. A munitions worker in Birmingham heard Miller's broadcast during her lunch break and cried into her sandwich, remembering her fiancé who'd been killed at El Alamein. A fighter pilot preparing to escort bombers to Berlin listened to Moonlight Serenade and wrote one last letter home, just in case. A French resistance fighter, huddled in a cellar with an illegal radio, heard American Patrol and knew that liberation was coming. The power of the music lay not in its sophistication, though Miller's arrangements were masterful, but in its associations. Every song carried memories of home, of peacetime, of a world where the biggest decision was which girl to ask to dance on Saturday night. In the midst of industrial-scale slaughter, swing music reminded people what they fought for: the right to live ordinary, joyful, music-filled lives. D-Day came on June 6, 1944. Allied forces stormed Normandy beaches as Miller's band broadcast to troops preparing to follow. The music provided a thread of normalcy through the chaos, a reminder that beyond the bullets and blood lay a world worth returning to. As summer turned to autumn, Miller grew restless. He wanted to take his band to France, to perform for troops on the front lines. He lobbied his superiors. He made plans. But logistics were complicated, and Paris, though liberated in August, remained unsafe for a 50-piece orchestra traveling with full equipment. Miller waited, increasingly frustrated. Associates noticed changes. He had lost weight. His uniforms hung loosely. He complained of sinus problems, breathing difficulties. He worked obsessively, chain-smoking through rehearsals and performances. Band manager Don Haynes noted with concern, his uniforms didn't fit him well at all, they merely hung on him. In a letter written that summer, Miller admitted, "I am totally emaciated, although I am eating enough. I have trouble breathing. I think I am very ill." But he didn't stop. The mission was too important. By November, arrangements for the move to France were finally progressing. The band would relocate to Paris, broadcast from the liberated capital, play for troops on leave from the front. As a precaution, they pre-recorded 80 hours of broadcasts, enough to maintain their radio schedule even during the transition. The move was set for mid-December. On December 11, 1944, Miller's executive officer, Lieutenant Don Haynes, flew ahead to Paris to finalize arrangements. Miller would follow in a few days, then the full band would come across. December 15th dawned cold and overcast. A fog hung over southern England, typical for the season. Miller was scheduled to fly to Paris in a small C-64 Norseman single-engine aircraft piloted by a 20-year-old officer. The plane was not authorized for VIP transport, but Miller was impatient. He wanted to see Paris, to confirm the arrangements himself. At approximately 1:55 p.m., the Norseman lifted off from Twinwood Farm Airfield in Bedfordshire. It was never seen again. For 9 days, the band continued broadcasting pre-recorded programs. Only a handful of people knew Miller was missing. The music played on, seamless and reassuring, while behind the scenes, frantic searches scoured the English Channel for any sign of wreckage. On December 24, 1944, the world learned the truth. Major Glenn Miller was missing in action. The announcement stunned both sides of the Atlantic. Newspaper headlines screamed the loss. Radio broadcasts interrupted regular programming. In Britain, where Miller had become almost as beloved as any British entertainer, the grief was profound. At dance halls across England, bands played Moonlight Serenade as tribute. Dancers moved slowly, heads bowed, tears streaming down faces. The music continued, but it carried new weight, the weight of loss, of sacrifice, of a war that consumed even those who fought with instruments instead of guns. But the mission was too important to stop. On Christmas Day, 1944, the Army Air Force Band assembled at their scheduled broadcast. The soldiers sat in stunned silence, instruments in hand, looking at the empty podium where their leader should have stood. Then Sergeant Ray McKinley raised his baton, and they played. They played for Miller. They played for the troops who needed them. They played because music, in the end, was larger than any single person. The show went on. And in that moment, the moment when music proved more powerful than loss, when American swing played on without its greatest champion, the cultural transformation of Britain was complete. The loud outsiders with their swagger and chewing gum had not conquered Britain. They had not imposed their culture through force. They had done something far more profound. They had made their music Britain's soundtrack. Spring 1945, London. The guns had fallen silent in Europe. On May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day brought millions into the streets. From Edinburgh to London, from Liverpool to Norwich, British citizens poured out of homes and factories and pubs to celebrate the end of 6 years of war. And they danced. In Trafalgar Square, impromptu orchestras formed from whatever instruments could be found. Servicemen still in uniform swung women in civilian clothes through jitterbug patterns. British Reserve, carefully maintained through years of rationing and bombing, evaporated in the sheer joy of survival. Strangers kissed strangers. Elderly women kicked up their heels. Children who had known only war now danced to celebrate peace. The music echoing off London's ancient buildings was unmistakably American. In the mood, blared from hastily erected speakers. Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree prompted sing-alongs from crowds who had learned the lyrics from Armed Forces Radio. When a band struck up Moonlight Serenade, the dancing paused for a moment of collective remembrance, for Glenn Miller, for the thousands who hadn't survived to see this day, for the music that had carried Britain through its darkest years. From one end of the country to the other, Melody Maker reported, people, relaxing after nearly 6 years of the most terrible anxieties, wanted to dance. The Glenn Miller Army Air Force Band, now led by Sergeant Ray McKinley, was still in Europe. They had continued their mission after Miller's disappearance, performing through France and Germany, playing for troops as Allied forces pushed into the heart of the Third Reich. They performed at Nuremberg. They broadcast from newly liberated cities. They played for over 1.25 million military personnel across Europe. By the time they returned to the United States in August 1945, they had fulfilled Miller's vision completely. His music had become the soundtrack of victory. The band's final concert came in November 1945 at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. President Harry Truman attended. When the band appeared to the strains of Moonlight Serenade, Truman stood and led the audience in spontaneous applause. He congratulated them for a job well done. The mission was complete. The musicians went home to civilian life. But in Britain, the music remained. At village halls across East Anglia, in London's Grand Palais, in church basements converted into dance floors, the jitterbug continued. British dancers who had learned from American GIs now taught their children. The energetic swing that had once seemed so foreign had become thoroughly British, adapted, modified, made their own through years of integration. The 50,000 war brides who left Britain for America carried culture in both directions. They brought British propriety to American homes, introduced their American in-laws to tea and cricket, taught their children about a distant homeland that had shaped them. And when they visited Britain in later years, they brought with them the latest American music, the newest dances, maintaining the cultural bridge that swing music had first constructed. Sheila Kent, who had worked as a signals operator at Debden Airfield, spoke decades later about the American presence. They left an impression on Saffron Walden, and the people of the town have never forgotten them over all this time. The same could be said for villages and towns across Britain. The Americans had come and gone in just 3 years, but their impact endured across generations. American air bases remained in Britain throughout the Cold War, a continuing military presence that maintained cultural connections. Young British people growing up in the 1950s encountered American servicemen at local dances, heard the latest rock and roll before it crossed the Atlantic commercially, learned new dance styles that evolved from swing's foundations. The cultural exchange that began with Glenn Miller's orchestra expanded into every corner of popular culture. American films dominated British cinemas. American fashion influenced British clothing. American slang crept into British speech. The special relationship between Britain and America, often credited to political and military cooperation, was perhaps most deeply rooted in the cultural bonds forged on dance floors during the war years. Research conducted decades later by economists David Schindler and Mark Westcott revealed the lasting impact of the American presence. They studied present-day attitudes toward minorities in parts of Britain that had once hosted American troops, comparing them to areas that hadn't. The data showed that exposure to Black American GIs had permanently changed British racial attitudes. Areas that hosted Black American servicemen showed measurably more positive attitudes toward minorities 3 generations later. The cultural impact, it turned out, could be transmitted through families and communities across decades. The children and grandchildren of Britons who had stood up to American segregation, who had placed Black troops-only signs outside pubs in Bamber Bridge, carried forward more inclusive values. The music itself never died. When rock and roll exploded in the 1950s, it built directly on swing's foundations. Elvis Presley's hip movements shocked British audiences the way Jitterbug once had, but the template was familiar, American music bringing energy, sexuality, and controversy to Britain. The Beatles, growing up in post-war Liverpool, absorbed American musical influences through their childhood exposure to GIs and armed forces radio broadcasts. British popular music became a conversation with American influences, a back and forth that enriched both cultures. By the 1980s and 1990s, a swing revival emerged. Young dancers, born decades after VE Day, rediscovered Lindy Hop and Jitterbug. Dance halls and clubs dedicated to authentic 1940s swing appeared in London, Manchester, Bristol. These modern swing dancers often learned the history as they learned the steps, discovering stories of their grandparents dancing with American GIs, of Glenn Miller's tragic disappearance, of music that helped win a war. Modern Britain hosts vibrant Lindy Hop communities that honor the dance's African-American origins while celebrating its role in British history. Teachers like Sarah Jenkins in London run workshops where elderly women share memories of dancing with GIs while their grandchildren practice the same moves. The connection spans generations, linked by rhythm and memory. In 2019, a reunion took place in East Anglia. Elderly veterans, both American and British, gathered at former airbase sites now converted to museums or farmland. Some arrived in wheelchairs, others walked with canes. But when a swing band struck up, in the mood, several veterans stood, found partners, and danced. Imperfectly, certainly. Slowly, with careful attention to aging joints. But they danced. "We were so young," an American veteran said, tears in his eyes. "We thought we knew everything. We thought we were so tough. The British taught us we didn't know anything." A British woman, now in her 90s, who had danced with GIs at the Palais as a teenager, smiled. "You taught us to let go," she replied. "We were so buttoned up, so proper. You showed us it was okay to laugh, to dance like nobody was watching." The music had done what diplomacy alone could not. It had made strangers into friends, enemies into allies, different cultures into something richer than either alone. The transformation was complete, irreversible, and ongoing. Today, if you walk into any British city, you'll find American cultural influence everywhere. McDonald's restaurants serve families. Starbucks cafes anchor street corners. American music dominates radio stations. The integration is so thorough that young Britons often don't recognize what originated in America and what's authentically British. But ask anyone over 70 about the Americans and watch their faces change. They'll tell you about GIs sharing chocolate with children, about dances that lasted until dawn despite air raid sirens, about young men who left England for missions they didn't return from, whose last night on Earth was spent dancing to Glenn Miller, about music that made you forget, if only for a moment, that the world was burning. The BBC occasionally broadcasts documentaries about the American presence in wartime Britain. Without fail, the soundtrack features Glenn Miller. Moonlight Serenade plays over footage of bombed cities. In the Mood accompanies sequences of dancers in the Blitz. The music has become inseparable from the memory of the era, a sonic symbol of resilience, hope, and unlikely friendship. In December each year, on the anniversary of Miller's disappearance, memorial services take place at Twinwood Farm Airfield, where he took off for the last time. Veterans, musicians, and history enthusiasts gather to remember the bandleader who never came home. A band plays his signature songs. Someone reads letters Miller wrote describing his mission, and the crowd stands in silence, recognizing that some contributions to victory can't be measured in battles won or territories captured. Sometimes, victory sounds like a clarinet doubling a saxophone section an octave below. The British villagers who dismissed American GIs as loud outsiders in 1942 couldn't have imagined what those outsiders would become. The swagger and chewing gum and casual informality that seemed so offensive gradually revealed themselves as expressions of something deeper. A culture built on possibility, on reinvention, on the radical idea that tomorrow could be better than today. That optimism, packaged in swing music and delivered through dance, was perhaps America's greatest contribution to wartime Britain. Not the tanks or bombs or military might, though those were essential, but the reminder, carried in every beat of In the Mood, that war was not humanity's natural state. That normal life included joy, dancing, music, laughter. That survival wasn't enough. You also had to live. The music accomplished what speeches couldn't, what propaganda failed to achieve, what even military victory alone wouldn't have delivered. It created a cultural bond that outlasted the war, outlasted the lives of those who first heard it, outlasted even the memory of a time when American GIs were outsiders rather than allies. In the end, Glenn Miller's greatest legacy wasn't his innovations in orchestration or his string of #1 hits. It was the simple fact that when British people today hear Moonlight Serenade, they think of their grandparents dancing, of survival against impossible odds, of a time when American and British cultures collided and created something neither could have achieved alone. The music became memory, the memory became history, and the history became an unbreakable bond. In scholarly studies, historians debate the American impact on Britain. They analyze economic data, military strategies, political alliances. They count the bombers and calculate the tonnage of supplies. All of this matters, certainly. But walk into a British pub on any given Friday night, and you'll still hear echoes of 1944. The way young Britons dance at weddings, incorporating moves they don't know originated in Harlem. The casual informality that has gradually replaced Victorian stiffness. The willingness to embrace cultural imports rather than reflexively resisting them. These changes trace back to those 3 years when American GIs filled British villages with music that refused to be ignored. "We thought we were teaching them how to dance," an elderly British woman said in a 2015 oral history interview. "But they were teaching us how to live." The transformation worked both ways. American servicemen who spent years in Britain returned home changed. They had seen a culture older, more rooted, less brash than their own. They had learned that confidence could coexist with humility, that progress didn't require abandoning tradition. Some of them brought British war brides home. All of them brought memories of village halls and warm beer, and people who welcomed strangers despite having every reason to remain wary. The cultural exchange didn't create perfection. Britain retained its class divisions, its imperial blind spots, its own forms of prejudice. America continued to struggle with racism, inequality, and the contradictions between its democratic ideals and segregationist reality. The music didn't solve these problems, but it created space for conversation. It forced both cultures to recognize their shared humanity. It proved that differences could be sources of enrichment rather than inevitable conflict. In 1985, a documentary crew traveled to Britain to interview people who had lived through the American presence. They found a farmer in Norfolk who had been a teenager during the war. He invited the crew to his barn, where they found something unexpected: a carefully preserved collection of American swing recordings, purchased or traded from GIs 40 years earlier. "Why did you keep them?" the interviewer asked. The farmer ran his weathered hand over the record sleeves. "Because they remind me that we're not as different as we sometimes think. Americans, British, Germans even. We all respond to the same rhythms. We all want the same things: safety, joy, someone to dance with on Saturday night." He placed one of the records on an old turntable. The needle crackled into the familiar opening bars of "In the Mood." "When I hear this," he said, "I'm 17 again, and the whole world is possible." That possibility, the belief that tomorrow could be radically better than today, that cultures could learn from each other, that music could bridge divides that politics couldn't, defined the American contribution to Britain. The GIs brought more than military support. They brought a vision of a different kind of world, one where people moved freely, laughed loudly, and danced like victory was inevitable. Britain, exhausted by years of war, desperately needed that vision. And when the music stopped, when Miller disappeared, when the war ended, when the GIs went home, the vision remained. There's a recording that exists in the archives of the BBC, dated December 26, 1944. It's a performance by the Glenn Miller Army Air Force Band, their first broadcast after the world learned their leader was missing. You can hear the difference. The technical precision remains. These were the best musicians in the military, professionals who had performed with civilian orchestras before the war. The arrangements are Miller's, instantly recognizable. But there's something else in the performance, something that can't be explained by notes on a page. It's the sound of people playing because they must. Because stopping would mean the loss was real. Because music, in the end, is how humans process grief too large for words. The broadcast reached troops across Europe. It reached British civilians huddled around illegal radios in occupied territories. It reached German prisoners in Allied camps. And according to letters later discovered, it reached at least one resistance fighter hiding in a barn in Belgium, who wrote, "When I heard them playing without Miller, I knew we would win." If music could survive his loss, we could survive anything. That resilience, the determination to keep playing, keep dancing, keep living even in the face of loss, became the enduring symbol of the era. The music had started as entertainment, as a morale booster, as a tactical weapon in the cultural war against fascism. It ended as something more profound, proof of human tenacity, creativity, and the stubborn refusal to let darkness have the final word. Britain today is a different nation than it was in 1942. Some of those changes came from necessity: rationing forced resourcefulness, bombing forced resilience, sacrifice forced solidarity. But some came from choice, from the decision to learn from the loud Americans rather than simply tolerate them. The village halls still stand, many of them. They host different events now: yoga classes, community meetings, children's birthday parties. But occasionally, a local historical society will organize a 1940s dance night. People arrive in period costume. A swing band sets up in the corner, often including at least one musician whose grandfather played with American GIs. And for a few hours, 1,944 lives again. The dancers are not as polished as their grandparents. The music is not as urgent, lacking the edge that came from dancing while sirens wailed. But the connection is real, to a time when music literally helped save the world, when cultural exchange happened not through international conferences, but through shared rhythms on crowded dance floors. An elderly man attending such an event in 2019 was asked by a journalist what he remembered most about the American presence in his village. He thought for a long moment. "The noise," he finally said. "They were so bloody loud. Laughing, shouting, playing their music at volumes that seemed criminal. We thought it was disrespectful, inappropriate given that we were at war." He paused, listening to the band playing String of Pearls. "But you know what? We needed that noise. We've been quiet for so long, stiff upper lip and all that." The Americans reminded us that life isn't meant to be lived quietly. Sometimes you need to turn up the volume, throw your partner in the air, and let the whole world hear you laughing. He smiled. "They taught us how to be loud again. I think that's what saved us, in the end. Not just their military help, but their refusal to be diminished by darkness. They showed up with their swing music and their ridiculous confidence, and they said, 'We're going to dance our way through this war.'" There's a memorial now at Twinwood Farm, the airfield where Glenn Miller took off for his final flight. It's a simple stone marker with his name, his rank, and the date he disappeared. On the anniversary each year, someone places fresh flowers. Usually, they also leave something else, a record, or a photograph, or a note written to a man who's been missing for 80 years. The notes say things like, "Thank you for the music that got my grandfather through the war. My grandmother danced to your songs with her American husband. They had 50 happy years together. You showed my country how to hope again." Music, in the end, doesn't follow the rules of war. It doesn't respect borders or acknowledge defeat. It can't be killed by bombs or silenced by propaganda. It moves through the world on its own terms, changing everyone it touches, creating connections that survive long after the musicians have gone. The British villagers who dismissed American GIs as loud outsiders in 1942 had no way of knowing that those outsiders would become part of their national story, that their music would echo through generations, that children not yet born would grow up dancing to rhythms first introduced by young men far from home. They couldn't have predicted that In the Mood would still be played at British weddings 80 years later, or that the jitterbug would evolve into modern swing dancing enjoyed by thousands, or that the cultural exchange begun in village halls would fundamentally reshape both nations. All they knew, in that moment, was that their ordered world had been invaded by Americans who chewed gum, dated their daughters, and played music at volumes that seemed almost violent in their intensity. What they learned, gradually and irreversibly, was that sometimes the best invasions are the ones that arrive with trumpets instead of tanks. That the most lasting victories are won not through conquest, but through culture. That music can accomplish what diplomacy cannot. The transformation of strangers into friends, enemies into allies, and different worlds into one world dancing to the same rhythm. The loud outsiders became family. Their songs became Britain's soundtrack. And when the music finally stopped, when the last GI went home and the dance halls dimmed, something remained that could never be taken away. The memory of a time when swing music saved the world. Not through force, but through joy. Not through domination, but through invitation. Not by demanding change, but by playing something so irresistibly good that dancing became the only possible response. In the end, that's what the Americans brought to Britain during those 3 extraordinary years. Not just military support or material aid, but a reminder that humanity's greatest weapon against darkness is not hatred or vengeance. It's the refusal to stop dancing. It's the determination to keep the music playing, even when, especially when, everything seems lost. It's the simple, radical act of turning up the volume and inviting the whole world to swing. The music played on, and Britain, despite itself, learned to dance.